All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know there might be some more joining us, but I certainly want to turn it over to our wonderful speakers. So again, for those of you just coming in, welcome to our webinar. This is on the revised dyslexia definition explained. My name is Kristen Sinclair, and I have the honor of introducing our speakers here in just a moment. But I serve as the incoming president of our North Carolina Board of Directors. So on behalf of all of our IDEA boards of the southern regional branches, which include Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, and North Carolina, we are so pleased to be offering this timely webinar on our revised IDEA definition of dyslexia. So in tonight's webinar, we have Doctors Haynes and Catts, who are going to discuss the 2025 revised definition of dyslexia, which reflects both continuity and growth in the field's understanding of dyslexia. So this includes the recognition that dyslexia occurs across languages and often impacts many aspects of an individual's life beyond reading and writing. So this revised definition builds upon IDA's 2002 working definition, and it preserves those key elements while also integrating insights gained from research over the last two decades. And before we begin, I do want to thank all of you that submitted your fabulous questions when you registered initially for this webinar. As a reminder, if you have other questions as you engage in this webinar today, please put them into the chat box. The chat box is being monitored this evening by Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom, who is on the board of our IDEA Georgia branch, as well as our IDEA national board members. So please feel free to populate that chat box with any questions that you have as we're going through tonight's webinar. During the Q&A, our speakers are going to address as many of your questions as time certainly allows. So now, without further ado, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Haynes, who's a professor emeritus at MGH Institute of Health Professions, and is a pioneer in language-based curricula for children with dyslexia and expressive language challenges. His cross-linguistic research spans English, Japanese, Arabic, and Portuguese. And he has authored from Talking to Writing, Strategies for Supporting Narrative and Expository Expression, which was done in 2018. He has also been honored by the International Dyslexia Association, both with the Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award and the Legacy Award for his enduring contributions to the field of dyslexia and related language learning disabilities. In addition, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Catts, who is a research associate in the School of Communication, Science and Disorders at Florida State University. His research interests include the early identification and prevention of reading disabilities. He is a past board member of the International Dyslexia Association and past board member and president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. He has received the Samuel T. Orton Award from the International Dyslexia Association and the honors of the association from the American Speech Language Hearing Association for his career contributions in each of these disciplines. His current research concerns the early identification of reading and language disabilities and the nature and assessment of reading comprehension problems. So please join me in a warm welcome to both Doctors Charley Haynes and Hugh Catts. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks again for having us.
Yep,
Charley?
I just wanted to echo those thanks. And I really wanted to thank the Southern branches for being so kind and inviting us. Hugh, are you there?
No, are you going to do this part? You're going to get it started here with
Sure,
it.
I'll start us off. So we're real happy, and we really want to emphasize that this is an international evidence-based update, moving from being more Anglo-centric to being trying to really describe dyslexia from a sort of a global perspective. Malt Joshi was a co-chair with us on our steering committee. The Really want to thank the IDA Definition Steering Committee, who contributed a lot. Juan Quinones and Jialan Lai helped us out with a really important seminal survey of advisors. And, I'll share the iterative process we went through, but Dyslexia Definition Advisors Group and dyslexia community members for their thoughtful responses to the iterations. We went through three iterations of the definition. Um, uh, and I'll let Hugh take over here.
Yeah, I was part of the committee in 2002 where we revised the 1994 definition, and uh, Reed Lyon, who wrote a paper describing the changes that were made and reasons for changing and so forth, noted that it was a working definition, and meaning that as we learn more about dyslexia, we would uh, uh, again revisit the definition and make revisions. Surprisingly, it took 23 years to do that. There was some energy along the way. I think pre-pandemic, there were people talking about, what we might do and so forth. But we've learned so much since that 2002 definition was put out that we finally there was just enough initiative to where we needed to get together and look at the definition. Again, we just learned so much. There were a number of different phases that were part of this definition. The really three phases I think we're going to talk about, right, Charlie, tonight. Uh,
Yep.
there was a recruitment of a steering committee and an advisory committee, a little bit different than what we did before. Initially, there was just a group of about 12 of us, and we got together, mostly researchers, and came up with a 2002 revision. But this year there was a desire to include more individuals in the process and people with different backgrounds. And so we set up a steering committee, which I'll show you in a few minutes what they look like and who they were. But we also had an advisory committee that of about 100 people, 75 participated in the process to help us come up with the initial draft of the definition. And then we took the initial draft and we sent it to the IDA board to get feedback. We also got feedback from our steering committee, and we put that together into a draft that we sent out for public comment. And we had a huge response to the public comment. Are you going to talk about that later, Charlie, about how many we had?
Yeah, I'll get into a
Yeah,
little
so
bit of the details.
it kept Charlie and I and Malt, the rest of the group, busy for a couple of weeks trying to read these and understand what people were saying, because we really did want to incorporate good ideas that were coming in that we hadn't thought about, right? And then we revised and distributed that and presented it at IDA in Atlanta. All right. So the steering committee had 14 individuals, and there was about 100 or so that were in the advisors, but like I said, only about 75% or participated. Uh, we did an initial survey with those, and Juan and GLN helped us with an analysis of that. And then we met in Houston to discuss, what we needed to do for the initial draft. This is a little slide showing the diversity of the group. We had administrators, advocates, evaluators, teachers, and researchers. The advisors are in the orange bar, and the members of the steering committee are in the bluish teal color. And you can see it was a similar breakdown from the two groups of people. We also had people from a number of different races, ethnicity um, in this group, and then quite a few languages involved. What is it? 16 languages that the people in the this was our steering committee, right? Or was it? Yes,
And similar for advisors
or
group as
advisors, yeah.
well.
So we had there was a desire to, we are the International Dyslexia Association, so we wanted to make sure that we had an international representation. So most people, English was their primary language, but we had a host of other languages, and you'll see in a minute that turns out to be important when describing dyslexia. And one of the main questions we asked the advisors was, did the definition need to be revised? And fortunately, most people agreed that it did need to be revised. There were 34% substantial revision, and then 29 or 60% with a minor revision. So all but 6% agreed that we needed to revise the definition. So we took it upon us ourselves to come up with an initial draft. And we did that in Houston. And here we are. This is a steering committee. You can see we're a pretty diverse group. I have to laugh. Charlie, we should have put this other slide in here, but I have a slide of the World Federation of Neurology, who did the first definition of dyslexia. And they're all in suits and ties, and there's one woman in the group of 15, right? Fortunately, we have much more diversity here. We're a little more casual. Right? I'm not wearing sunglasses there. Those are transition glasses, and we're in the sun. But we had wide range of ages, race, ethnicity, and expertise. We had researchers and we had practitioners. We used this expertise and experience we had, combined with the data that we were getting back from the advisors. They have answers that they did on a Likert scale, and they also had open-ended questions that we asked. We used that information and we combined that information with papers. Charlie's doing the changing of the slides, and you're doing
Yeah,
a great job so far.
I'm trying.
Oh no, you're doing great. And uh, 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 Tim Odegaard sent out a call for papers about 2 years ago to a number of different groups to ask for critiques of the 202 definition and what we might do with that definition, what revisions we might want, and so forth. And there were 6 papers that came back. Tim and his group did a little introduction to it, and we used the information in those 6 papers. We sent them around to the committee, and people read those. And since then, there's another paper that's come out by Linda Siegel and colleagues, and all those are available to a certain extent in Annals of Dyslexia. Some of them you may have to write directly to the authors to get it, but it's a wonderful set of papers, and we're able to use these papers. And during the meeting, what we did was we talked about the different components that were in the 202 definition, and what other components that we might add to that definition, right? But we spent limited time on wordsmithing. We didn't want to get stuck in what the words were that we were going to use to put into the definition. Charlie and I and Walt came back and did that with a first draft, sent that draft back to the committee. They gave us some feedback. They didn't like that word or that ways of phrasing it. We tried some other ways. We got consensus in the steering committee, and then we sent that off to the board for their approval. And Charlie will talk a little bit more about that later on. But what I'm going to talk about now is kind of the discussion that we had during that Houston meeting. We had 2 days to talk about different components and the research that we gained over the last 23 years or whatever. Um, the right off the bat, we all agreed, unanimous agreement, that dyslexia is a word level literacy problem, and it involves problems in word reading and or spelling that can either involve accuracy, speed, or both. And the particular manifestation of dyslexia is going to depend to a certain extent on the language and orthography that we're talking about. So I have to mention that for a minute. What factors within orthography that could affect either the types of reading problems or the factors that might underlie those reading problems, right? And one of them is called the unit of orthographic representation or grain size. But simply what this refers to is what aspect, what level, let's say, of language does the orthography map on? Orthography's the writing system, right? What do the graphemes map onto in the language, right? Most individuals in the world read alphabets. In that case, it's letters mapping onto the sounds of the language. Other orthographies, it's graphemes mapping on to syllables of the language. So Japanese, for example, doesn't have that many different syllables, so you can come up with a system where you can map the graphemes onto syllables. There's others that a combination of alphabets and syllable um, uh, mapping. And then finally, Japanese and Chinese kanji actually have symbols or characters that directly relate to morphemes within words within the language, right? Now, the mapping of those is not always consistent. We have some degree of what's called orthographic transparency, right? And there's some languages that are very consistent, one-to-one correspondence of same letter refers to the same sound and sound to letter. It's not perfect, but some languages do have high consistency to where other languages much less consistency. Now, all languages, all levels of representation vary, across language in terms of this transparency, but you see it most in alphabets. So alphabets that are used in Finnish, Italian, or Spanish are very transparent and they're easy to learn to read. So kids learn to decode most words within the first few months or so of school. So they can actually read most words pretty quickly. They don't get the stress patterns right and everything, but they can sound the words out because there's very high consistency. Individuals with dyslexia in those languages typically have problems in automaticity and speed at which they read. And they'll decode, but it'll be very slow in the reading. At the other end, English is a real outlier in this transparency um, uh, notion, along with Danish and to a certain extent um, French. Um, because of the inconsistency, it adds another level of difficulty to understanding how letters map onto the sounds of language, right? And if you're an individual that has difficulty with figuring out how letters corresponds to sounds, maybe due to phonological problems or other type of problems, you're going to have real difficulties learning Danish and English. And we all know that from our experiences with kids with dyslexia in English, that this problem with doing that mapping leads to kids developing other strategies for recognizing words, looking at more global strategies, like how, the first letter, how long the word is, so forth. And you get very poor, um, uh, uh, less detailed uh, orthographic representations of words, which leads to a host of difficulties. The best indication of this is non-word reading, right? Pseudo word reading, because you have to rely on your knowledge of the correspondence between graphemes and phonemes. And in fact, in Danish, the test that's used to identify individuals with dyslexia is a pseudo word or non-word reading test, right? And I think that has implications for English as well. All right. Um, Back to this notion of representation, the unit has some influence on what types of problems, underlying problems, might lead to difficulties in reading. All the languages, orthographies, make contact with the sound structure of language at least to some degree. Even Chinese, the characters that are used in Chinese provide some information about the sound structure of the word, often very opaque fashion, but they do provide some information. So what we see is phonological processing problems impact difficulties across different grain levels. But in languages like Chinese, one's explicit and implicit knowledge of morphology can aid in reading words. And we'll see individuals with dyslexia have problems in morphology, morphological awareness, so forth. We see those same types of difficulties in some alphabetic languages like Hebrew or Arabic, where the consonants and word can provide some information, semantic information. So individuals that have better semantic skills will be able to learn those language more quickly. English is slightly different in the sense that early on, the most important features to help a child learn to read is their recognition of the phonological structure of the word and the mapping of that to the letters of the, I'm sorry, to the letters that correspond to it. So this mapping of orthography to phonology is quite important. And it may be that it's the reading early on that draws children's attention to morphology and helps them with morphological awareness, recognizing that plural S is, I mean, plural is designated by the same letter, draws your attention to that as a morpheme. Certainly, kids have implicit knowledge of that, but the explicit phonological awareness is probably reading draws some attention to the morphological level. But after you begin to recognize that morphology is important in the spelling patterns of a language, you'll see that morphological awareness becomes more critical in reading multi-syllabic words that have multiple morphemes in it, right? Hope that helps because we're going to include both of those in the definition. I went into that. Yes, morphology. All right. The other thing that we talked about was the continuum of severity in reading problems. For the traditional view was that dyslexia was a categorical condition in which you have or you don't have. And there was a classic study early on that suggested that there was a hump at the lower end of the distribution that represented kids with dyslexia. And you see that, the little red group down there, and you could identify by dyslexia by finding that hump down there, and those are the kids with dyslexia. Plus, there was idea that kids with dyslexia had a distinct profile that was different from kids that were poor readers, sometimes called garden variety poor readers, that were also down there at the lower end of the distribution. But both of those, the presence of a hump and the fact that it may be distinctive, have not held up as we began to look more closely at the distribution and the characteristics of individuals with dyslexia. One of the early studies that showed a normal distribution, you can use your cursor here, Charlie, to show that in the middle range is where most people fall in that. What is this? Yeah, most people fall within that middle range there, and you see fewer people out of each of the tails of the distribution, and that's a normal distribution, which many of human characteristics fall under: height, weight, so forth. Um, we also showed that same effect in the data from a large study in Florida that showed those distributions, but only after a certain degree of instruction, because initially you're not going to get a normal distribution. The one on the left here, the right here, is a distribution, kind of a drawn distribution of what it might look like at the beginning of kindergarten, where there's a lot of kids that haven't learned to read yet, right? So they haven't had experience, so they're not going to spread themselves out, right? It takes a bit of time for kids to show their strengths and weaknesses in word reading, but not that long. This is not a wait to fail notion, right? A wait to fail? Yes, wait to fail notion. That by the end of kindergarten, beginning of first grade, we got a pretty normal distribution there, and we can use points in that distribution to help identify kids that are having severe and persistent reading problems. But But the difficulty is, where is that point? If it's a continuous distribution, where do you say that dyslexia begins in low reading? Dyslexia ends and low reading begins. Right? Some people want to put that cutoff rather high on the distribution and say 1 in 5 individuals have dyslexia, right? While others will argue that it's closer to 1 in 10, and you also see this 5 to 7% of the population having dyslexia, right? But the important thing to recognize is no matter where you put that line, kids that fall below that point, put him there. A kid that falls below, yep, good. And the kids that fall right above that point and a little further up the distribution are where they are on the distribution for the same set of factors. All right, that those factors uh, are continuously distributed. That is, they're on a continuum as well. And the kids that are below the line are kids that have more severe cases of risk of those risk factors, to where the kids that are right above, they have that same risk. It's just not as strong as the kids below. And the other important thing to note here is those kids below don't have a consistent profile. And it's not the case that we can measure a bunch of cognitive abilities and identify kids that are highly likely to be low and persistent readers. That group down there is different in their characteristic of what the risk factors are that contribute to a child having severe and persistent reading problems. All right. That same notion of continuity is within the neurobiological basis, right? We understand the genetic basis of dyslexia. We used to think that there would be, just a few genes, but it turns out that there are hundreds of genes related to reading, each perhaps contributing a small amount of variance to reading. They're not specific to reading. We haven't been reading long enough that we have genes that are specific to learning to read. For the most part, these genes have been in the human genome for thousands of years. They're ancient genes that have impact on things like brain morphology, that is, structure of brain, and connectivity. Their impact on reading and outcomes is not deterministic. They don't determine you're going to have a reading problem. What they do is they increase the probability you're going to have a reading problem, because there's other characteristics, other cognitive factors that genes control that actually promote better reading, right? They're protective or promotive factors, and kids can have those in combination with risk factors, and that can impact their outcome. There's also the case that genes always, let me say it again, always interact with the environment right from the beginning of life through development. So environment is always going to be present as a possible risk factor for dyslexia. The severe examples of that is trauma, and the stress that comes from it, but other factors like malnutrition, chronic illness, and then factors like disadvantaged home and literacy and language environment. Those latters are not going to by themselves cause dyslexia. There's agreement in the field that it does have a neurological basis, but those other factors are always going to be present, always the potential for them being present. Charley will talk a little bit more about the issue of environment later on, but I think having it in our definition allows us to address where the impact is in environment. Uh, the disruptions that genes cause are not like lesions, right? They're more like differences in brain structure and function, and these differences overlap with same differences with individuals that don't have dyslexia. So it's not the case that we can use a brain scan to identify an individual with dyslexia. All right. There's no brain-based marker for dyslexia because of the variability that we see in the brain and its relationship to typical reading and individuals with dyslexia. All right. Next. Um, the uh, the primary deficits that we've associated in the definition have to do with phonological processing problems, Um, but what we talked about in the meeting was that we see individuals with dyslexia that don't have phonological processing problems, and we see people who have phonological processing disorders and don't have dyslexia. Right? So it's not a necessary or sufficient cause. That's different from the last definition. We also have additional factors that contribute to dyslexia, and that's led to a view of dyslexia. Next slide. That's dyslexia is a yeah, that is a multifactorial causal models. That is, that there's multiple factors that add and interact to result in dyslexia. Phonological processing still seems to be a very important deficit in individuals, particularly those learning alphabetic languages. But there's other factors that interact with that. Uh, this fits well with the notion that there's many genes, fits well with the probabilistic nature of dyslexia. And, and it also, in these models, we talk about resilience because we'll find kids that have the same types of risk, but end up with different outcomes because of different levels of resilience. Yakov Petcher and I came up with this kind of diagram here using a seesaw. On one side, you got factors that increase risk. On the other factors, you have resilience that decrease that risk. Phonological factors, language factors, kids with problems in vocabulary and syntax, even if they're not particularly severe, can add to the risk of a child having a problem. Factors related to RAND, there's evidence of visual problems. They account for a small percentage of the variance, but nevertheless part of that variance. On the other side, the most important resilience factor is instruction. Good instruction can reduce the risk. And maybe if we have time, we talk about some of the others. Going a little fast to make sure we have time. All right, let me take a breath. uh, uh, the uh, we also spent quite a bit of time talking about cognitive referencing. The old definition used kind of an unexpected notion. And what that said was that the problems that children had in reading and phonological processing were not expected based upon their other cognitive abilities. Right. And the reason that got into the definition to begin with was it was one of the few ways we could still argue that there was a neurological basis for it, right? Because uh, without direct evidence of a neurological basis, people thought, well, what we could do is show that they had normal other abilities, but they have problems there, therefore they have a neurological basis to the disorder. But what happened was people drew upon IQ as the indicator of where kids should be reading, right? And IQ is not a really good indicator of reading ability because the factors related to reading are somewhat independent of your IQ, right? Um, but we still have people that are drawn to this notion of IQ achievement. Um, and we have the media portraying these very bright individuals who have dyslexia. Sure, there's lots of really smart individuals with dyslexia, but the vast majority of individuals with dyslexia are like kids without dyslexia. They have normal or even below normal intelligence. And then when we go and actually look at it, we compare kids with lower IQs. Next slide, Charlie, that have IQs, let's say 70 to 85 to kids that have above 85 IQs. We find that there's not much of a difference in the types of reading problems, the brain basis, the underlying cognitive factors, and they both respond to intervention in about the same way. All right. So there's not a good reason for preventing a diagnosis of dyslexia for kids that have somewhat lower intellectual abilities. As we move down toward kids that have more extreme intellectual difficulties or disabilities, those kids are going to need different types of services, and there's going to be different considerations there. So we're going to have to think about other things besides a dyslexia diagnosis. It's not saying we couldn't diagnose dyslexia, but we're going to be concerned about other factors in those individuals. Um, Secondary consequences. Charlie will talk a little bit about these. I'm not going to take time up here. Charlie, you can go over to what some of these are, but there's one that I really want to mention here, and that's the psychological well-being factors that kind of got left out of the last definition. That having a reading disability is an affective uh, 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 difficult difference, I'd say, deficit. Charlie, next slide. Because people with reading problems can have heightened anxiety, low self-concept. I mean, just a host of negative consequences that really don't have to be there. And that's why I myself and others, next slide, Charlie, uh, have argued that we need to think about a prevention model for dyslexia. Now, when people hear me say that, well, you're not going to prevent the biological basis of it. We're not arguing to prevent the biological basis of it. What we want to prevent is the reading and the secondary consequences, the reading problem, the secondary consequences. And we can do that by identifying the kids early and providing instruction that matches their level of need. I've been involved in early identification work for over 30 years now. We've gotten a lot better at measures, but our ability to identify risk has not gotten all that much better because the samples that we're dealing with, the kids within schools are more diverse in terms of their backgrounds and languages, and it makes it even more difficult to identify kids using the typical screeners that we've developed. We can get a pretty good moderate level of accuracy. We're going to identify kids that are going to turn out to be false positives, but that's where response to instruction comes in. That kids that look to be failing screening instruments, even though we know a lot of those kids are not going to end up with dyslexia, short-term response to instruction can help us identify those kids that need that further intervention. And my argument is, what better evidence of a child having a reading difficulty than a child having a reading difficulty? All right, that it should be the primary characteristic of dyslexia. And this intervention ought to be early and um, we know that it's more impactful that if it's given at kindergarten and first grade as opposed to later on. All right, Charlie, I think I left you some time, about
Th
30 minutes.
Thank you, Hugh. So Hugh described the sort of phase one part, and uh, all of the information that Hugh just summarized nicely for us, we used for developing or creating sort of elements that needed to be in the definition. And you'll see those echoed when I actually walk you through the definition itself. So in phase two, we distributed that draft out to the advisors. 55 of the initial 74 responded. Again, as Hugh noted, he and I integrated feedback into the draft. And then we engaged in this kind of iterative feedback loop with the steering committee. It wasn't quite as linear as this seems to be. It was this back and forth. And then we finally devised this uh, statement that went out for public comment. And I was a bit distressed to see on Spell Talk that everyone thought that that was the definition, when in fact that was the public comment version that was being publicized. And in fact, we got a really large number of people responding to our public comment. We had 3,500 people, as Hugh noted earlier, a large number who at least accessed the survey, and then of those, uh, uh, about 67% of them were more we could call them practitioners. They were reading specialists, reading coaches, diagnosticians, testers, teachers, and only 3% of the people who responded identified themselves primarily as researchers, as opposed to the steering committee and advisors groups, where it was around a bit more than 50% of people identified themselves as researchers. So you can see that this definition is really, and in the group that Hugh was in, I would say that 90% of the people in that group were researchers. So you see a kind of evolution toward uh, being more inclusive of the larger dyslexia community in terms of the data that we were gathering. So, of the total number of 3,500 people who gave their demographic information and accessed the survey, 1,500 of them filled out this Likert scale question. And with the public comment version, you can see that 70% of people fully or mostly supported it, and 22% at least partially supported it, with only 10% not supporting it at all. Um, and we didn't just say, okay, we've got it now. We basically went and looked at the open-ended comments and did some analyses of the kind of uh, the degree of favorability of the 10 key draft definition elements. And even in the public comment version, it ranged from 90% to 99%, with literacy support before and during the early years clearly showing highly favorable responses. So, but despite the favorability of the comments, we went through and analyzed the open-ended comments, clustered them in themes, and further edited the definition, and then again engaged in this sort of iterative feedback with our steering committee, with doing this kind of wordsmithing to the final state of the definition, which we reported at the IDA conference in October. And again, here's the definition. Many of you have looked at it already, but as I read this, think of the research that Hugh just gathered for and summarized for us, and you're going to see it popping up again here. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability characterized by difficulties in word reading and or spelling that involve accuracy, speed, or both, and vary depending on the orthography. These difficulties occur along a continuum of severity and persist even with instruction that is effective for the individual's peers. The causes of dyslexia are complex and involve combinations of genetic, neurobiological, and environmental influences that interact throughout the individual's development. Underlying difficulties with phonological and morphological processing are common, but not universal, and early oral language weaknesses often foreshadow literacy challenges. Secondary consequences include reading comprehension problems, reduced reading and writing experience that can impede growth in language knowledge, written expression, and overall academic achievement. Psychological well-being and employment opportunities also may be affected. Although identification and targeted instruction are important at any age, language and literacy support before and during the early years of education is particularly effective. So that's the definition, and now you've heard it kind of within the context of the research that Hugh just summarized for us. Now I'm going to move through pretty quickly and explicate a couple of the items. Just to point out, some of you wanted the definition to stop here with the sort of identifying features, causes, and characteristics. But in fact, there's a good body of prior examples of including secondary consequences, not just in our 2002 definition, but also in the UK Rose report, as well as the Delphi dyslexia definition. Uh, um, so we one of the questions that a number of you asked was what did we particularly wrestle with in the definition? We wrestled a lot over the term specific learning disability. We discussed the downsides of using the term disability. And a number of us kind of invoked Gordon Sherman and so many, the whole sort of neurodiversity movement as being a reason not to include it. And all of us concurred that it's really important to identify and leverage strengths in all learners. Uh, but we noted that the term specific learning disability is in the WHO definition of dyslexia. It's also in federal law, IDEA, as most of you know. So we thought about the implications of removing it versus keeping it in. And in the end, we decided that the upsides outweighed the downsides. Uh, Another term, a number of you asked why we didn't include the word fluency. Let me help dig into that a little bit. Um, uh, in the definition, we said that the difficulties with word reading and spelling involve accuracy, speed, or both, and vary depending on the orthography. The accuracy and speed are the key components of word level automaticity, which in turn supports text level fluency. And we address the terms automaticity and fluency in the explanatory document that accompanies the definition. We also use the word or both because it reflects cross-linguistic evidence that accuracy and speed difficulties may often co-occur, but they also can appear separately. And Hugh talked about that when he addressed kind of differences in reading difficulties across orthographies. Key point is that the developmental and diagnostic weight of each of these factors, the speed and accuracy factors, varies across world writing systems. And we really encourage you to access David Scher's marvelous piece of scholarship, Blueprint for a Universal Theory of Learning to Read, the combinatorial model. If you really want to dig in deeply into this topic. Hugh talked about the continuum of severity. Again, that reflects the understanding that the word level difficulties in dyslexia distribute normally on a bell curve, and that we also use the word persist because, if a child has the flu or an upset stomach or they got into a fight with their parents before they came to school, and then we test them. They may perform poorly that day, but the use of the word persist signals that the difficulties endure over time. To represent the concept of disability, we thought it was best to reference performance deviating from that of peers receiving similar instruction. Because we know that if a child is in a situation where they're deprived completely or receive extremely poor instruction, and they're compared to children who receive a very different kind of instruction, that we're measuring something different. We know that weak teaching can hinder anyone's learning, so the word reading and or spelling difficulty has to be specific to the individual. And for it to be specific, it has to be evident even with teaching that is effective for that person's peers. The combinations of underscores the multifactorial point that Hugh made. I wanted to talk a bit about environmental factors because I would say that they may be one of the that word may be one of the potential flashpoints in the definition. And we address this in the explanatory documents, but the environmental factors refer mainly to instruction and its interaction with genetic and neurological influences, the factors that shape risk and resilience that you talked about. The definition does not say environment is the cause. So it's not saying it's a primary cause, nor does it say that the presence of environmental influences should exclude a child from a diagnosis of dyslexia. That's a really important point. Throughout development highlights that the influences act and interact across the individual's developmental arc. We Our inclusion of the term morphological processing highlights morphology's key roles in reading and spelling, both implicit and explicit. So it's not just morphological awareness, it's actual kind of underlying morphological ability and the kind of implicit morphological skills the individual has. And this is important across languages and writing systems, as Hugh noted. The term but not universal was upsetting to some because they wanted phonological processing to explain everything. But in fact, the fact that neither phonological processing or morphological processing are universal signals that they explain much, but not all the variation in reading and spelling. The reference to early oral language weaknesses, foreshadowing, highlights evidence linking early language delays to later challenges in word recognition, spelling, and comprehension. So if you read Snowling, and Hugh was the one who shared this excellent article with me, many of you have probably read Snowling and Hulme's Risk Factors for Dyslexia. They actually had a bias. They reported their own bias, the initial bias against including underlying oral language difficulties in dyslexia. You know, the argument was that people with pure dyslexia don't have underlying oral language impairment. But in fact, as they did this sort of meta-analysis, they found in their study, and many other people have found the same, that uh, oral language difficulties are more prevalent than we may have suspected, or at least mild oral language difficulties. But you might want to read that Snowling and Hulme article if you're interested in this. So the last point underscores, you know, this, although identification and targeted instruction are important at any age, this language and literacy support before and during the early years of education is particularly effective. That obviously underscored the value of early targeted instruction, how impactful it is. But we were also careful not to say that, you know, if you're picked up later, it's a hopeless situation. We made the point that although identification and targeted instruction are important at any age, that clause was an effort to show that good systematic instruction with children in later grade school, middle school, high school, even in the adult years, can be highly effective. So, what does the IDA definition give us? So, for parents and persons with dyslexia, we're hoping that the definition provides validation, that it provides perspective and understanding. And we also aspire for it creating hope in that it stresses that early and targeted instruction works and that progress is possible at any age. For teachers and reading specialists, we hope that it actually contributes diagnostic precision. The accuracy, speed, or both specifies the universal cross-linguistic features of word-level reading and or spelling. We also think that it has some instructional implications, that it persists even with instruction effective for peers, that distinguishes the learner within school environments, and it raises the question of the types of instruction that are needed. It also underscores the linguistic basis, as I just noted, and also it has large implications for the whole person. We're noting the possible consequences for comprehension, expression, and well-being. And it also lends a sense of urgency when we know that the secondary consequences, particularly of unremediated dyslexia, are serious, that lends urgency to all of us. I know I'm preaching to the choir right now, but I feel similarly passionate as you do about it. For researchers, it notes that it provides a kind of integrative framework, noting the multifactorial genetic, neurobiological, and environmental interactions. We also have contributed, we have given it cross-linguistic scope, and we're aligning more with international reading science. Uh, the We also are pushing for researchers to use a kind of dimensional model, thinking about a continuum of severity that's underscoring that dyslexic reading or spelling is not separate or distinct from other forms of reading difficulty, a word level reading difficulty. We also emphasize the importance of a developmental cascade, which I'm hoping will further underscore the importance of longitudinal research that follows children over time. That's a very powerful research model. And for all the groups, we emphasize the policy linkage by retaining specific learning disability. It's consistent with the IDEA framework as well and indirectly with the with both the IDEA and WHO frameworks. So let's talk a little bit about what the definition cannot do. It can't detail the scientific nuances, the unique characteristics of dyslexia in different orthographies, or how does dyslexia relate to dyscalculia or math difficulties? And there are a variety of patterns of it coexistence with ADHD, DLD, and also there are a number of cognitive and memorial processes involved that Hugh alluded to that we could have included in the definition, but it would have made the definition more encyclopedic in nature. It also doesn't specify assessment tools. It doesn't tell us what assessment protocols we should use, and it doesn't designate diagnostic criteria such as cut scores or thresholds on a continuum. This is all political work that we need to engage in as advocates for children with dyslexia. We need to be arguing where the cutoffs should be. We need to be saying these are research-based assessment tools. These are research-based assessment protocols. Um, uh, it also doesn't provide a step-by-step guide for instruction or intervention. Many of you ask questions about intervention. The most I can point to, that Hugh or I can point to, are like the components of what is involved with dyslexia. And you can imagine that with each individual, it will vary, of course. But the primacy of word level reading, speed and accuracy, and as well as spelling, those are fundamental. But even when you start looking at children who are showing some secondary consequences of dyslexia, then you start addressing areas like reading comprehension, other factors as well. And it does not lay out standards for optimal instructor education and training. Most of you are familiar with the knowledge and practice standards that a number of you actually participated in developing for IDA, the couple of iterations that we've had of that. Eric Treatise and colleagues have translated the knowledge and practice standards into Spanish, working with Spanish colleagues around the world. This is all the work that we do as members of the dyslexia community. And it can't be, it's the definition is there to provide sort of elemental description of causes and consequences, but it's our job to do this work. It doesn't serve as legislation or policy in itself. It has to be translated into law and regulation. It doesn't ensure funding or service delivery for the children and young adults and adults that we care so much about. When political will is lacking, we need to generate that. We need to go out on the hustings and argue for that. It doesn't prevent misuse of the definition. For example, Hugh was showing you the cutoff scores. If you do cutoff scores that are extremely low, and say that only that group of children deserves support, then you're excluding students who need, obviously excluding students who need support. So here are our next steps. We're engaged actually in a phase 4 where we've placed on the IDA website. This is all around dissemination. Put on the website the definition with an explanatory document. It's now no longer a draft document. It's formal there. And also we included our much of this same presentation that you've seen right now. We've been disseminating the definition in conferences or gatherings like this one right now. Hugh, along with Malt and I, Hugh is the primary author. We've written an article not unlike the Reed Lyon and Shaywitz article that came out in 2003. We've written an article and submitted it to Annals. And we're also talking about the kinds of articles that need to go into perspectives as well. So here's what we ask you. We ask you and our colleagues in the dyslexia community to study the definition and the explanations for the key changes. Then you'll be well informed about it. When you have people making claims about different components of the definition where they clearly haven't read the explanation that accompanies it, it gives you an opportunity to be an informed kind of companion of ours, a colleague of ours in disseminating the definition. We ask you to join us in sharing this revised definition in your respective venues. And remember that, like definitions that preceded it, this is a working definition. We're going to follow the evidence as it emerges. And when the definition is revisited again, as it must be, we all should be ready to advocate for changes that will serve the larger dyslexia community. So, on behalf of Hugh and myself, we want to just thank you for this opportunity to interact with you. And we can't thank you enough for just your kindness in inviting us. At this point, I'm going to move into Hugh. You're still there.
I'm still there. You're doing
Oh,
a great
good. I
job.
didn't put you to sleep, my friend. That's good. So here are some of the questions that a number of people posed. We could go through them. Uh, if you eyeball them, maybe you could put into chat the question which is perhaps most important to you. You could list the number of that question if you wanted, or we can just kind of walk our way through these questions. What are your thoughts? I see 2, 5, 3. I want to hear them all. 3. Okay. It looks to me as though we've got a all. Okay, so we'll just walk through them. Um,
And I
uh,
want to make a quick note. Thank you very much for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
amazing.
go ahead, Jen. Was there anything that kind of stuck out for you that you'd like us to target? Because you had kindly offered to sort of listen and give us some feedback.
Yeah, I do have just a couple of ones that aren't listed on this slide, and one in particular I want to make sure we do get to. But with respect to the first question about screening, I did share a webinar and a link to it about the future of dyslexia screening that was hosted by EdWeek in mid-November. That was fabulous, and they really do, I think, dive into the weeds with what we can expect and answers that question. So that's something you all can take a look at. But I
Yeah.
think we can go with that list, and I'll make sure we have time for another question that did come up.
I before I kind of share again the set of questions, I'm looking at Christy Beaver's. Christy, thank you for your thanks. You said with the 2002 definition, the inclusion of the word unexpected seemed to make a clear division between dyslexia and other reading disabilities. So, how would you explain the differences to, say, parents and administrators seeking an understanding of dyslexia and the new or this revised definition? Um, Hugh, you're welcome to tackle this. I just wanted to first say we know so much about dyslexia now that to call it unexpected is, I think that in and of itself is problematic. We know a lot of the factors that contribute to word level reading and or spelling. Uh, uh, it's no longer a debate, a huge debate. We're still learning new things, but it's not an unexpected difficulty anymore, an entirely unexpected. Hugh, did you want to
No, I mean, I kind of went over that, but I think the point unexpectedness means that because of some other characteristic, you would expect the person to be able to read better. And if you're going to do that, you'd want to pick a, a benchmark that would be related to reading in most individuals, right? So, if IQ in fact did a pretty good job of predicting what one's word reading abilities were, and you found an individual who did not read at that level, you could call that unexpected. But reading ability, word reading ability, tends to be somewhat modular in the sense that it's not closely related to some other cognitive abilities that we might have that we could measure through IQ tests. Certainly, it's related to the verbal part, and that's why I say it's not completely unrelated to intelligence, because verbal abilities that are part of intelligence contribute to your word reading ability, right? But they don't predict your word reading ability. The composite of intelligence doesn't predict your reading ability well enough to use that as a benchmark and say it's unexpected. Right. And so I think that's moving us toward a diagnosis of dyslexia that's based upon severe and persistent difficulties learning to read and spell. And that's the primary characteristic of dyslexia. And that's the core aspect in our definition, the core aspect in other definitions that had recently been revised or created.
So I'm going to just look at the questions. The next question is, how will the revised definition change the way we screen students? Thoughts about that or comments, Hugh?
Are you asking me? Well, uh, I don't know that the definition itself is going to change the screening. There's not specific information that might address that, but we seriously have to change the way that we are screening. There was this movement to introduce universal screening in the states across the nation, and we moved very quickly without considering what the evidence said as a whole, the nuances of the evidence. So we have written into law that certain cognitive abilities need to be measured at different times, often between K and third grade, that all of these need to be identified or screened during that period of time, when some of those aren't relevant at different points in time. the most relevant factor for identifying a reading disability in a second grader is reading, right? That all those factors that are part of that screening battery that you might measure have already incorporated themselves into the child's reading performance, right? So you've already measured their phonological awareness, the RAN, so forth. As long as you're measuring speed and accuracy of word reading, all right, uh, it's had that impact. So those others provide very little information once you get to at least second grade. Early on, kindergarten, you could get more information from some of those other measures that are part of the battery. Perhaps in first grade, you can find a few of those that could provide some information. But this extensive kind of screening battery that we've now proposed that be done at a universal basis isn't based in the developmental progression of the characteristics of dyslexia. The definition doesn't really address that, but it needs to be addressed. And there's others that have spoken to it. I think Tim Odegaard has spoke to this a number of times in papers he's written as well.
And again, the webinar that the screening
Hmm.
feature of screening for dyslexia is really quite impactful if you watch it and really gets into the weeds with it all.
The next question that I hear is, how does the revised definition impact identification of English language learners with dyslexia? Uh, I just wanted to make one point. In general, as Claude Goldenberg at Stanford noted, the same factors that we use for identifying dyslexia in monolinguals generally apply for identifying them in English language learners. Some people have reported to me in a number of the presentations I've done that there's some states that uh, say that if a person is an English language learner, they don't qualify for dyslexia services. That makes no sense whatsoever. And in fact, if you look at the definition that we have, if anything, it makes very clear that environmental factors, among other factors, can contribute to uh, different outcomes for word recognition and spelling, may need to be taken into account. Um, uh, uh, and it's very important not to exclude children who are English language learners from a possible diagnosis of dyslexia. One needs to make sure and assess them in their L1, as all of you know, in both their oral and their written language if they've learned to read in two orthographies. But their oral language, if a different language is spoken at home, you definitely want to assess there. But that's common knowledge. It's practices, good practices that we've been using all along. Another question is, who is qualified to diagnose dyslexia? Uh, and there are sort of two answers to it. Number one is whatever the laws are in your state, those are, we can't break the laws. We can argue to change them. But in terms of the actual underlying question that you're asking, um, uh, if one has competencies in the different areas that are outlined within the definition, if they're competent with delivering assessments, they're certified and competent to assess word level speed, accuracy, uh, some of the secondary spelling, some of the secondary consequences, reading comprehension, underlying language. you start to see that this is actually kind of like a laundry list of capabilities, but the most fundamental ones would have to do with the primary characteristics of dyslexia. So uh, 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 the definition doesn't say who is qualified. That's really for us to argue.
And Charlie, thank you for that answer. And Hugh, there was one question I want to make sure we do get to. Melissa O had posted it at the very beginning of the webinar, and I just reposted it. Are you able to clarify if the revised definition now implies students meet the criteria of dyslexia if they demonstrate persistent difficulties with spelling, even in the absence of reading difficulties? This has significant implications for identification and intervention, service delivery in schools.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say definitely yes. In fact, it's interesting. I know a number of uh, people who are fairly competent readers. They may not read super quickly, but who display significant spelling difficulties.
Yeah, as long as the spelling difficulties are severe enough in terms of the continuum of severity, yes, and particularly in languages like English, to where kids can gain some degree of success with word recognition. It's likely to be slow, but may not qualify on a test of word reading ability. Many of those kids will continue to show significant spelling problems. And the thing about spelling is it's not simply a spelling problem. Having a spelling problem has downstream effects on your written expression. You only have so much working memory to allot to writing. And if one is spending considerable time dealing with the spelling of the word, then you're not going to learning to be a more proficient writer is going to be difficult. And some people say, well, spell check does it for us. The problem is that individuals with severe reading problems, I mean, spelling problems, cannot even attempt to spell the word, right? That to get it close enough for
Or
a
they spell
spell,
cryptically, so a decoder can't
yeah,
figure it
spell
out.
checker is not going to be able
Yeah.
to see it now. And I know that personally as somebody who has a history of poor reading, but survived it, but continues to have pretty poor spelling. And I can tell you that spell checker does not sometimes find the errors that I'm looking for.
Gay Landish, pardon me, or if it's Catherine, I'm not sure. There's the question of what this implies for kind of uh, twice exceptional kids. A number of people have asked, once you remove this sort of unexpected piece, uh, is it going to penalize students who are gifted? Um, what was interesting was when we looked at the studies with gifted and dyslexic kids, uh, all of all of them showed at least somewhat below normal reading abilities. So we didn't see evidence of students who were showing superior word recognition abilities in those studies. So that uh, i- if a child has poor word recognition, they can be extremely bright, but they would qualify because they have a poor word reading and spelling abilities. I don't know if you're talking about kids who are sort of like around, maybe they have a global IQ of 130 and their reading score is a 95, which is above the district's cutoffs. I can imagine scenarios like that, uh, but otherwise, it doesn't fit even with the sort of um, uh, gifted and dyslexic literature.
Yeah, I mean that's right. I mean the definition states that one needs to have a word reading or spelling difficulty either in speed or accuracy. So we may find that individuals with twice exceptional individuals may still have difficulties in their reading fluency and their speed of reading. But if they don't have a reading problem and only have a discrepancy between a very high IQ and a average reading ability, right? Uh, we wouldn't identify those individuals, according to our definition, revised definition, as having dyslexia because dyslexia primary characteristic is a reading and spelling difficulty. And
And or
again,
spelling.
that high IQ is not predictive of that individual reading better. So it's not unexpected in the case that that individual has a high IQ but average reading ability.
Well, one question was, what are the implications of this definition for um, overall identification of children with dyslexia? Will more children be identified? And again, that's related to sort of where the cutoff scores go. If you in your if in your district you argue for an RTI or MTSS model where you have good quality instruction at sort of tier one whole classroom level, then that will take care of that should help take care of the kids who have sort of mild reading and or spelling difficulties. Uh, uh, the Yeah, go ahead, Hugh.
Charlie, the thing that I really like about the definition and where we're moving in terms of understanding dyslexia is that this understanding of dyslexia has implications for kids that don't qualify for a dyslexia diagnosis. What we're learning is it's the same set of factors that contribute to where the child is on this continuum of reading ability. And that has implications for what we might do for kids that fail to be identified as having dyslexia, but still are poor readers, right? Those individuals could benefit from similar types of intervention, maybe not as explicit, maybe not quite as intensive as what we might do for individuals with dyslexia. And what we ought to think about is what is the child's reading abilities, spelling abilities, and what do we need to do to assure that that individual has some degree of proficiency in word reading? Because that's actually the goal of what we're trying to achieve here, right? Is to help all kids learn to decode with some degree of fluency so that they can use this skill to acquire knowledge, to enjoy literature, to text their friends, whatever it might be that literacy is for. And and I think that the new understanding could help us move towards something like that. Help us move toward watching kids progress in word reading and spelling and addressing the needs of kids that aren't moving as quickly, regardless of whether they're identified as dyslexic or not. Right? That's an important distinction for public law, right? But it has implications for kids that don't qualify for dyslexia.
So one concern that I heard voiced in some of the questions was what are the implications, the definition for current public law efforts? I thought that was a good question, Hugh. And for example, we have a Cassidy bill that includes in it um, uh, this idea that there should be an IQ discrepancy, the kind of unexpected component. That's an example of something that's going to need to evolve over time. There are other states that are just about to vote on laws using previous iterations of the definition. It's difficult to come in right at midstream or near the end of the process and say, hold everything, stop. Those laws will may be enacted, and then, it will take several years to kind of revise them appropriately. Um, this is a revised definition, and it's coming out at a point in time, and it's going to have. We're hoping it will have a sort of long-term cascade effect on laws as they are formulated moving forward.
Yeah.
Maria asked a good question. How can we connect the new definition to structured literacy? Some of us debated whether we should actually incorporate the term structured literacy. That's very much of an IDA. I think IDA is actually, what do you patent a term or copyright? I think it's a copyrighted term, but in fact, we debated about that, and I think that we opted for the term uh, target. We use the term targeted, uh, but we don't specify the dimensions of structured literacy
We
within
actually
within the definition.
actually in
The
the
explanation does, yeah.
explanation, we do offer that as an example of an appropriate intervention.
Mm.
It's also something about schools finding loopholes. They always do.
Well, I'm going to close off the question and answer portion of our webinar, and we cannot thank you enough to Dr. Catts and Dr. Haynes, and we'll pass it on to Mandy.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Haynes and Dr. Katz, we are so thrilled with this conversation. And I think that I, for one, could probably listen to it every night to help me begin to understand the depth of knowledge and perceptiveness is just amazing and inspirational. That connection between the definition and the structured literacy. We have been talking about how that is a terminology and an approach that we want everyone to use. So it hasn't been copyrighted. It's something that we want people to use and understand and make those connections. And in Florida, we have really been surprised at how many adults are reaching out to us because they were not served. And so this definition is something that we're very excited about on our board, hoping that this will help us find ways to serve them. So thank you so much for all of this. And we want to thank our participants for enjoying the treasure of expertise that Dr. Haynes and Dr. Katz shared with us tonight. We're so glad that you were here too, and we can start evangelizing and spreading the word, right? So if you have colleagues who missed tonight's webinar, please let them know that all the registrants will be receiving a link to the webinar as well as the slides from this presentation. We are working to send a link tomorrow. I don't know how you all are doing that fast, but at any rate, Thursday to December 11th, they're hoping to get that out. On behalf of the boards of the IDA branches across the Southern region, we appreciate your attendance at our webinar tonight. Dr. Haynes and Dr. Katz, you guys provided a lot of great information for all of us to think about. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, wonderful holidays, and thank you for attending. Good evening.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy your
Thank,
teaching.